Welcome to the Poets and Philosopher Podcast. I'm Abe.
And I'm Sam.
And we respect the great tradition.
We're also brothers.
We talk about great ideas and the Christian life.
If you're someone who loves philosophy, old books, ancient ideas, and God, you should subscribe.
Today, we discuss Plato's tripartite soul. This is an idea that I think once you understand its basicness, then you begin to see it just about everywhere you go, from advertisements to stories to music to even parts of a speech. This is a wonderful idea that in some sense is almost dangerous to think about, because it's like, is this actually true, or is it because we think about it so much it actually becomes true? But I think it has some merit in and of itself. I think it's something that Plato intimated at or intuited to, thought through and said, okay, discovered, maybe that's probably the best word to use there. He discovered this idea inside of a few of his works here. I think you've got Phaedo, the Phaedrus, and the Republic, this idea. And so this is how he starts it off with, at least. He says in the Republic, he says here, "It is clear that the same thing will never do or undergo opposite things in the same part of it and towards the same thing at the same time." So, to say it simply, a rock never rolls in two different directions. It's always going to roll in one direction. So, if it's the same thing, it's going to roll in one direction. So if we find this happening, that is, something rolling in two different directions, we shall know it is not but one thing, but more than one. So he thinks that if you have something that goes in two different directions, then there's more parts working at it. And he looks at ourselves, and I believe that when he started thinking about this, he said he gave this analogy of you walking by a grotesque scene. And whenever you're walking by a grotesque scene, there's always this part of us that says, should I look? I shouldn't look. Should I look? Should I not look? It's like why everyone slows down whenever there's a car accident. It's like they're interested, but also it's like I don't want to see like an arm hanging out or like a body that's or somebody like writhing in pain. I don't really want to see that, but like I've got to stop and I've got to see anyways. And so there's like a part of us that goes back and forth as far as should I do this, should I not do this? And Plato, from that, posits that we have more than one part than us. And there's three parts to us, according to Plato. I think there's a lot of merit to this idea. It's one that I think through a lot, but it's one that I still go, I can be unconvinced of this, but I haven't been yet. So, Sam, what are the parts of the soul here for us?
So we have, and we can put every single part of the soul to a specific part of our human anatomy. So he says the head represents the rational principle. The Greek word is noetic. So I think we're probably going to be talking about rational, noetic, or logos. We're all talking about that rational principle in us, and it's that the head kind of represents that. And then you have the heart represents the spirited part of man. This is the thumotic. And then you have the bowels or the loins represent the appetitive nature of every person. And the Greek word here is the epithumotic. Actually, epithumotic in Greek really talks about lust. It's kind of your sensual desires, your senses, the bed and the table. And it longs for like money or gain, women, food, and then the heart, the spirited part, that longs after, it loves courage, and courage, victory, and then we have the noetic part, the head, that's love, is wisdom or knowledge.
Yeah, so those are the three parts of the soul that Plato seems to see and divide out for us. And this is a very famous idea of Plato's, the tripartite soul, but probably made most famously whenever he talks about the soul and the city. And so during Plato's Republic, there's a portion in which he wants to describe how a proper city should, or a proper soul should function for the sake of justice. And so he makes this analogy between the city and the soul. And why is this such an effective analogy, Sam? Why do you think this is very helpful for us to think through the city and the soul as things that have a lot in common?
One thing we want to do when we try to analyze something that's very small and difficult to analyze is to blow it up, to be able to investigate its parts. And the soul is quite small. It's inside of us, and it's going to be kind of hard to grasp its curves and its nuances. So what we can do is we can blow it up. And Socrates says in Plato's Republic that the soul is an analogy. I'm sorry, that the city is an analogy of the soul. He says the city is the soul writ large. And if we look at the different aspects of a city, we will see, because the city is made up of souls, we'll see what the soul does, how the different parts influence each other. So I was actually going to read, I have my Alan Bloom's translation of Plato's Republic. In their discussion, what they're trying to talk about is what is justice? That's the main topic of the Republic. And finally, Socrates says, is a city bigger than one man? Yes, it is bigger, he said. So then perhaps there would be more justice in the bigger, and it would be easier to observe closely. If you want first, we'll investigate what justice is like in the cities. Then we'll go on to consider it for individuals, considering the likeness of the bigger in the idea of the small, of the littler. So why don't we investigate what justice looks like for a city? And that's going to have a lot of import on our understanding of justice for the soul.
Yeah, that's very helpful because it's tough to know what's really going on in a person's soul. It is much easier to discuss what's going on in a city because you can actually see with your own eyes. Whereas a soul, you could only conjecture and use, deductive or inductive reasoning to say, okay, this is what seems to be happening because this is happening. But how exactly, that's difficult. And so we think of the city as a way to describe this. But this also really relates to how a city rules itself. So each city is going to have a different form of government that's going to load onto these ideas. And you can think about the city that is ran by a single person, which is we would call a monarchy or a kingship. This is a noetic form of government. It is ruled by a single ruler, and you want this person to be very wise to do this. And so that would be a rule of government. It's the rule of the one. Then you have the rule of the few, which is sometimes called an aristocracy or a republic. And this is ruled by a few of the people that are sometimes elected, or sometimes this is just the position they have through other means. It's the rule of the few. But then you have your last case, which is a democracy. It's the rule of the many, the rule of everybody. And so those are the forms of government. And each of these cities are going to be dominated by a particular attribute related to how it's ruled. And so a kingship is going to be ruled by, you would hope, wisdom in that sense. And then the aristocracy is going to be ruled by courage, and probably democracy, hopefully it's ruled by temperance. So those are the regimes of a city. It helps us to think through these things. And that has implications about how the city's actually going to get run. And so they're always battling each other. And I think we'll do another podcast episode on this form of government because it's very helpful to think through these types of government, because each of these types of government is going to drift towards one section. And there's a good side of this government, there's a bad side. So, there's a monarchy, a kingship, which is wonderful, but then you have a tyranny, which is bad. And each of those has their good side and their dark side that we'll discuss probably in another episode. But this theme idea, this connection between the soul and the city is helpful for us because as we look at the world, we can actually figure out ourselves. This is part of why it's helpful to read different literature, is because a lot of times in literature or in stories and stuff, we see basically like the conflict of the soul happening on screen for us, and that's really helpful. So Sam, what are some examples of this conflict on screen happening for us in like movies or books or things like that? Where else do we see this idea of this tripartite or this threeness shown to us?
I wonder how many listeners, I guess, have read The Brothers Karamazov. That's a book that I'm reading right now and studying. I'm hoping to write about it. And this is so there's three characters. There's more than three characters, but there's three main characters, the three brothers in The Brothers Karamazov. Dmitri is the oldest. He's 27 years old. He's dominated by his passions. You see him always talking about money. He's always seeking to get drunk and to get alcohol and wine, and he is chasing women, and he is dominated by that portion. Now you see a beautiful character development in Brothers Karamazov. In the end, he becomes a loving person, someone who is transformed. The second son is Ivan, and he's 23 years old, very smart. He went to the university. He published a few book reviews, and he was well known for those book reviews. Some of them were pretty controversial because he wrote against the church and state being linked together, and a lot of secularists and atheists kind of got on his side, and he pretty much disbelieves in the immortality of the soul and even God. And he is the noetic figure. And then finally you have Alyosha. He's the youngest, and he's spirited. He's the one who loves humanity. He loves his father, even though his father is a worthless man. His father pretty much just forgot his kids. And it's these three figures. It's the appetitive, the noetic, or the rational, and then Alyosha, which is the spirited, the passions. And you see these three brothers, the chemistry between them and how they relate to each other, and it really is the drama of the soul. And one thing that Dostoevsky does really well, and he's a very, psychological writer. He makes me think a lot about psychology, and there's a lot of things he writes about that I don't know why he writes them, and it makes me think about why people do what they do. But when Dostoevsky writes about these three parts of the soul, it's complex. That Dmitri at the end, he's developed. That means the soul can develop. Also, Dmitri is not just about money and women and drinking. He can have a very soft conscience and see the truth in things. And then you see Ivan. Ivan also is an appetitive person at times. Alyosha is also seeking not women, but he can want to be, I guess, in the monastery, and he is not. He's an introvert, which you wouldn't think that with a spirited person. The idea is that the soul is so complex that these simplifications can be taken too far and become simplistic, and that's one expression of the Platonic soul. And I think it's great to see the drama between them, but you can also see it with like Star Trek, between Spock, Bones, and Kirk, or you can see it in Wizard of Oz with the Tin Man, the Lion, and the Scarecrow. These all represent one part of the soul, and it causes a beautiful drama to see them work together.
Yeah, I think that's important to state that there's not a that somebody who is dominated by a certain part of the soul, somebody who's the noetic, is not simply just going to be like the deep thinker. Like, first off, that's not true to life, because obviously there's parts of us and parts of certain days of our lives where we're dominated by certain sections. Whether we're tired or whether we've had a good night's rest or had a good meal. Like those parts, they're always in conflict with one another. And that conflict creates a really good story. And that's, I think, the reason why it creates such a good story is because that's how we feel a lot. We feel like there are parts of us that are always fighting together. It's like when I woke up this morning, or just woke up just about any morning, there's always this battle of I should sleep more, or I should get up and do some work, or whatever it might be. But those are the two main ones. And because of that internal battle, I have to negotiate with myself. Should I stay in bed, or should I get up and go do things? And that, I think, relates to this conflict of the soul itself, that there's a part of me, in my appetitive part that says, just sleep more, Who cares about the future? Let's just think now, and let's go to sleep. Whereas my spirited nature is like, no, let's rise and meet the morning, and wake up before the sun gets up, and get some things done before my kids wake up. And that's how I should live my life. And so I have to negotiate between that. And so Plato actually has this analogy with the charioteer. And this charioteer analogy, I think it's in the Phaedrus, which he has one side. So he's got two horses pulling in different directions, and there's the rider of the chariot who negotiates on which way to go. And so his idea is you have the mind of the person, the noetic part, that is the charioteer, and he negotiates between the appetitive nature and the spirited nature of a person, and that's how an integrated person is. He directs these two. Some people would say it's not really like that. It's more like a fly trying to control an elephant. That's a better way of explaining how we are, because I think a lot of us understand that most of our lives is dominated by staving off our appetitive nature. The part of us just says do what you want to enjoy right now in the moment, and don't think about the future or think about the past. Just enjoy what's now, and that's a dangerous part. A dangerous way to live into, and a lot of times it leads to sin. So this reflection is just about everywhere. And Sam, you've mentioned a couple of good ones. You've mentioned those stuff from like The Wizard of Oz and Star Trek, and this also, if I just asked you, those of you who are listening, all right, about Harry Potter, which part of the soul does Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley represent? You could probably figure that out pretty easily, because Hermione, she's obviously the smart one. She knows how to cast all the spells, and she gets it down. She's a noetic principle. She's always trying to make sense and explain things logically. She does not like divination, that sort of thing. Whereas Ron, although it's not so one-sided though, because Hermione, she cannot play chess or wizard's chess at all, whereas Ron can. But Ron mostly is a man who's an appetitive by nature. He loves the sweets and such, and that sort of thing. Whereas Harry, he's the man of action most of the time in the story. Your hero is going to be that spirited nature of a person. He's going to be like the person who wants to do those great things. And a lot of times they have a lot going against them, but they still want to do it anyways, even though there's a lot going against them. And that is what makes a good story as well. You think about parts of a speech. You've got the logos, the ethos, and the pathos, the Greek ideals of a speech. You've got the actual content. You have the way you present the content. Then you have your own character. And those seem to load on to the noetic, the thumatic, and the epithumatic of a person. And you could just keep going with this. You could even go as far as with music. And in music, there's the melody, the harmony, and the rhythm, and those would load on to, again, the same parts. So it's like you look at the world and you begin to see this pattern in the world, and you go, wow, this is something else. But the question we really do have to ask at some point is this actually true? Do we actually have a tripartite soul? And that's one that's really tough to answer. So, Sam, where do you land on that when you think through this? Like, is this actually how it is?
I'm trying to think of how you could falsify this, because the way you could falsify this, I guess, is just to say, it it doesn't give you any ability to predict the future. So one thing with these, I mean, I would like to know, oh, are you an intellect? You know, is your intellect, or is your rational principle, your logos, your head, does it dominate you? If so, I will likely know what motivates you, and I will likely know what your vices are. Or if I could see that you are dominated by your spirit, if you're very spirited, you're like a warrior, then I could see, yeah, what you're motivated. You're motivated by fame and victory, and I could also know your vices. And the same thing with the appetites. So I I wonder with like personality, like I think the whole personality types, there's a lot of people interested in those right now. There's a book that there's an author really that kind of combats this idea of personality types and how there's not that much they're not tested, not scientifically, but there's not that many studies that prove that they actually are something. But I know a lot of Christians, that are interested in the 4 love languages. Those are different personality types. You have the Myers-Briggs, you have the Enneagram. So are those valid? What would it mean to say that those are valid? What would it mean to say this tripartite soul is valid? I see it in the world. I see people who are motivated by wisdom and truth. I see people who are motivated by fame and um, accomplish things. And then I also see people who are really driven by the here and now, the money and looks, appearances, and that would be the demos, the average person, who's dominated by their appetite. So I think it's valid. I I am I think it's valid. So that's my vote. What about you, Abe?
Yeah, it's like one of the things that I would try to do is all right, will the scripture show these things to be true or not true? And there's no direct answer, I would say, as far as here's the parts of your soul. There's no verse that would say that. But God does tell us to love him with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And if you don't take soul there, you kind of part that aside. You get your mind and your heart and your might, or yeah, with your might, you have those seem to be the 3 parts of a person. So the mind and the heart and your might. So those seem to be there. But and then it's also Paul's idea of a soul, body, and spirit. I think you could see those being the 3 parts of a person. But is that what Paul was actually saying? Was he really buying into this belief? And was God was saying to love him with those things? Is that the point of this? He's like, oh, this is a way to unlock the 3 parts of the soul through this verse. And it's quite possible. And that's where I'm at with it. At this point, it seems very utilitarian. I think there's a lot here that is useful, and it's a good tool to have in your back pocket to think through things, especially if you're writing a speech. You want to make sure that your speech is composed of these 3 different parts. If you're writing a proposal for something, you want to make sure it's composed of these three parts. If you're writing a story, you want to make sure that your characters exemplify these 3 and have conflict over these 3 things. So I think there's a lot of truth to this, and this is how I would talk about it most of the time. But how does this relate to Christian thinking? I think that's a tough one to show with that. Maybe, and I'm not really sure about this, but you can think of the Father, the Son, the Spirit being represented this way as far as the logos, the appetitive, and the spirited section. I'm not quite sure if that loads very well, but I think there could be something to that. So I guess the last question we should kind of focus on here is, what part should dominate our lives? Which part of us should dominate our lives?
Being someone who reads Soren Kierkegaard, as well as other, I guess, existentialist philosophers who see a lot of history. A lot of people, Plato himself, it probably comes from Plato. um, emphasizes the spirit so much, or I'm sorry, emphasizes the rational principle, the logos, so much that that it becomes imbalanced. And I do think, like, let's say Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha is the hero. He is the one who becomes balanced. Ultimately, at the beginning, he wants to lock himself up in the monastery because it's the only place where there's no sin. That's not good. But we also see Ivan. Ivan is the imbalanced soul, and he's imbalanced in his intellect. And he is the atheist. And we see where his life goes. He becomes miserable, and he has no sense of morality. And then I mean, I don't think anyone's going to say our life should be directed by our appetites. That would be a hedonist or a narcissist. But I don't think that any of our listeners would ever probably say cast their vote and say, I really think that it's really between the intellect and the spirit. Should we be dominated by a pursuit for truth, or should we be dominated by the active life that we need to be participating in the world for, I guess, fame and accomplishment? I think you know there's four different virtues, and I'm not sure if we've talked about this yet, but the virtue of the intellect is wisdom, is prudence. The virtue of the spirited is courage. And that's between, if you want to be courageous, that means you're not being timid, nor are you being reckless. You're being courageous. The virtue of the appetites is self control, moderation, prudence. Well, justice is the fourth virtue. There's four cardinal virtues. It's the fourth virtue. It is the balance of all of them. And that's one thing. If we focus on each of these parts too much, we become imbalanced, we become inhumane. And I want to emphasize the spirited part because we need to be people who are passionate for God. We're passionate for the love of other people, and it's not just about doing what is true. Well, it is doing what is true, but making sure that truth is significant, that it's full of love. Ultimately, when you love God, you know, if I want to love my wife the best, I will love God with all my heart, soul, strength, and mind, and through that, I love my wife. Through that, I go to work, and I'm a good worker. Through that, I I I eat food that tastes good, and I um yeah, I was gonna say something else about sex, but I mean, I take part in all of these different ways, and I am a balanced person. So I want to, I guess, speak a lot for being balanced, but specifically, don't don't I guess poo-poo the spirited part and think that only the intellect should dominate. I mean, what's your thought on which part of the soul should dominate us?
Yeah, I maybe it's probably uh, a question that would be like, well, I don't think one should dominate. It depends on what you mean by the word dominate, but which one should lead? I do think it should be our logos that leads us, our mind that should lead us, but I don't think that the spirited part of us should be too far behind. I think you think of the people in Scripture who seem to be pretty well integrated people, as far as people who just did the right things. And I think about Moses, Paul, David, and Jesus, and those men in particular had this attributes of, well, number one, they were deep thinkers. Obviously, all of them were, and they thought and they wrote a lot of things, or at least they taught a lot of things. But also, they were men of action. They were ready to do things that had to be done, and that's how they lived their lives. And I think that those two integrations there are very helpful. And that's how we should live our life, is this integration of being led by our minds, but also enjoying the whole thing, I think is very helpful. God does not want our lives simply just to be automatons that just simply do the right things or even think the right things, but he wants our hearts, and he's after our hearts. And so we should live our lives in a way where our hearts are directed towards God and our affections are tended towards God. And to do that, we have to do it all. We have to do all kinds of things in order for that to happen. So that's what I would say about that. But I do like this idea of trying to figure out which one should dominate us, because it helps us think better about setting up our life in the right way.
Yeah, with these different personality types, normally people will not attribute any moral significance to any of them. So, like, if I were to ever ask someone who's really big into personality types, like our brother Paul, be like, "Hey, the word should I be an introvert or an extrovert?" Like, what? Like, there's no moral obligation for either. I mean, if you're an introvert, that's just how it is. It's okay to be introverted. But the idea is, if you are only an introverted person, that means that you are going to not be active in public life, likely, as I understand it, at least. And if the Christian life is both public and private, you need to be balanced and have both. So I think this question is saying, hey, is there one part that should dominate our lives? Which I think it's a good question because, I mean, for me, when we talk about personality types, I normally want to know which is the best kind. But most people are like, no, 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 it's not about that. It's just about your proclivities. What are you prone to do? Your tendencies. Oh, I get that. But should we be very philosophic and noetic and distant, like a stoic, distance ourselves from our passions? And I think a lot of Christians have been influenced by this Platonic soul. I think the Sadducees were actually quite influenced by the Platonic soul. That's why they didn't believe in a resurrection. Um, Actually, I have to think about that. But this idea that the body is evil and we don't want to have a body. To be enlightened, this is Platonic. To be enlightened is to get ourselves out of our bodies and to be in the realm of pure thought. That's not how God created the world. He created beings. There would be no matter in the garden in paradise if that were so.
Yeah, it's sin that created what it was matter, and sin is really begins with at least a part of the mind. So that would be one way to deal with that particular idea. I really hope this discussion has been helpful for those of you who have been listening. This is a topic that there's more to look at, and you'll probably see it in your own life. Maybe you got like 3 coworkers at work, and you're like, oh, this is how they do this. Or you've got some TV show that you really like watching, and you've got 3 main characters, and you're going to go, does it line up this way? And maybe it does, but sometimes it doesn't. But I think at the end of the day, what this helps for is if you're reading literature that helps you to read literature better, or even just other things. Like if you're going to read Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, he follows this formula like to the T. So he gives this idea, then he shows this idea by the noetic, the thematic, and the epithematic just religiously. And so that's one way it's helpful to know these things, because Aristotle just follows this on down the line. So if you enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate a review on iTunes. If you use iTunes to listen to this, or wherever else you listen to podcasts, we would appreciate a review. And we are excited to continue this podcast and discuss other ideas. And so we appreciate you listening. We'll talk to you guys in the next one.